Dr. Timothy Stanley is a historian of the United States of America. He is the author of the book The Crusader, The Life and Tumultuous Times of Pat Buchanan. His interests in American history include both the political discourses of liberalism and conservatism, as well as conspiracy theories as a historical and cultural phenomenon in the United States of America. You've previously said that in US history the debate regarding conspiracy theory largely falls into two camps, and one of them is understanding conspiracy theories as an irrational way and a rational way to understand bizarre sequences. Could you just explain both of those alternative camps?
On the one hand, you have people who argue that conspiracy theories are so self-evidently irrational because they pick on targets that can't possibly have the kind of power that people say they have, like communists or Jews or feminists or homosexuals. Some people say that they're so irrational and grand that they're constructed in order to justify and cover bigotry. And therefore they are an illogical and irrational response to complex problems that people fall into, either because they're too dumb or they're too mendacious to see the more complex reasons why things happen to people. So a classic example of that might be Jewish influence over banking in the 1930s during the New Deal period. That conspiracy theory is so obviously ludicrous that there's some kind of global alliance between bankers and Marxists that it must simply be a way of expressing prejudice that stupid people buy into and evil people use to manipulate them. The other point of view, which is a more recent one, which has been around since the 1990s, which blends psychiatry or psychology and history and politics, argues that actually conspiracy thinking is a rational attempt to try and make sense of things that make no sense. In some instances, they identify conspiracies which actually do exist, because we now have a greater appreciation of, in America, what the federal government has been up to in the last 40 or 50 years. We understand that they have tested on prisoners. We know about Watergate now. We now know through the Pentagon Papers about the incompetence behind Vietnam. So there is some evidence that there are some degrees of conspiracies that take place with the American government. And what people do is they try and understand the really big crazy stuff like 9/11 by conceptualizing it in the same structure as those conspiracies took place. So they will say that 9/11 is such an extraordinary event that there must be some way of understanding it. And the only way that makes sense is to put it into the context of other terrible things that the American government has done, and therefore understand it as a governmental conspiracy. So those are the two views: irrational, mendacious, or stupid on the one hand, rational but misguided and misled on the other.
Now, in terms of having an analytic tool bag to bring tools out of and conceptually analyse these conspiracy theories, for researchers in this area, it's obviously going to be a difficult task between separating a ludicrous and irrational conspiracy theory, such as Jewish control of the world or David Icke's alien theory, from actual what I classify as single point conspiracy theories, which are conspiracies that do exist at single points in time in historical events and social phenomena, such as Watergate and certain disclosures over the Vietnam War. That's obviously going to make it a more difficult task for researchers to dissimulate between the two, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that. When can you really assume that there could be some truth to a conspiracy theory?
That's a very good question, and it's a difficult one to answer. If you look at Watergate, when that story first broke, it broke around this time in 1972. It broke around June when the break-in happened, and the press pretty much ignored it for 8 months. It's not true that no one knew about it. The McGovern team actually cut an ad about Watergate, which effectively pointed blame at the White House. Everyone chose to ignore it. There was a sort of a mass self-imposed blindness or deafness about the story. People argue because McGovern was such an awful alternative choice that everyone didn't want to believe that Nixon was somehow involved in the break-in, so they ignored it. My point is that for a very long time, that conspiracy was not treated as a conspiracy, and people who were shouting that it was a conspiracy were regarded as left-wing radicals who were trying to create trouble for the president. Everything suddenly changed in February of 1973 when it starts to go to the courts and links are discovered between the White House and the break-in. So at that point, a non-conspiracy theory suddenly turned into a conspiracy theory. And from that point of view, I'm always respectful and sensitive to some conspiracy thinking because it is possible that there is some degree of truth in it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people involved have the motivations that conspiracy theorists apply to them, nor do they necessarily have the degree of competence that the conspiracy theorists apply to them. So in the case of Watergate, having become a conspiracy that we knew about, conspiracy theorists then push it too far to say that Nixon was personally involved in organizing and ordering the break-in, which we know we're pretty much sure he wasn't. And they'll then push it even further or say something like, and Nixon was in fact removed in a silent coup by the liberal powers and the media, etc., etc. So they will then take that conspiracy too far. But I do think that every theory that is raised deserves to be investigated, and I think deserves to be treated seriously, up to a point which is rational to the person investigating it. And for that reason, it is right that there was a commission into 9/11, not because it was a conspiracy, not because anything was proven to be what the conspiracy theorists said it was, but I do think it is reasonable to approach it as a possibility that there is a conspiracy involved, because sometimes in American history there has been a conspiracy involved.
Could you illustrate or give some examples where you think it's not rationally viable to pursue any conspiracy theories further? Because essentially we're always tied up in a historical and social context where we haven't got immediately, by definition, the luxury of hindsight. So a very popular conspiracy theory, which obviously went global for many reasons, is 9/11. Now, for the last decade or so, that has been largely by the mainstream disputed, but that's not to say that in 30 or 40 years' time, more evidence could come to light about what actually happened at September 11th, and there could be some facets of the conspiracy that could be true. And obviously you see this as well with Pearl Harbor, Vietnam, and certain instances with JFK. So whilst we're stuck here in the year 2012, and I personally believe that it's not rationally viable to pursue the theory that the US government was in on 9/11, that doesn't necessarily and immediately mean that in the future other evidence may come to light. So that's obviously a difficult task for social scientists and historians. How would you approach that idiom that you're never outside the historical context when you do investigations yourself?
One is never outside of a historical context, but neither are the conspiracy theorists. And I think one thing it's important to take note of is what is their motivations. 9/11 is a very complicated, complex, and potentially emotionally draining subject of conspiracy thinking. And the fact that some people not just point the finger at the government, but also are keen to give you crazy numbers and theories about the number of Jewish workers who were there during the day or Israel's involvement, suggests to me that we have to approach conspiracy thinking with some degree of nous and intelligence on what the theorists are about and what politically motivates them. That's important. Because 9/11 is such a complex example, perhaps, and such a traumatic and recent one, perhaps a better example is the assassination of Kennedy. Now, it was very rational to say that one man couldn't have got away with that, and that from what they understood of the ballistics, it didn't match the official narrative of what happened. It was doubly rational considering that the assassin was then himself assassinated, all of which looks terribly suspicious, plus you're in the middle of a Cold War context, plus the Kennedys have got a relationship with the mafia that was less than healthy. All of the conspiracy thinking surrounding that was actually perfectly rational, and the government did take it seriously, and it did investigate it. But 30 or 40 years on, the narrative is still exactly the same. We have not changed our mind. We still think Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole shooter. So that to me is a good, healthy example of approaching conspiracy thinking with some degree of respect, some degree of reason and rationality. And ultimately, the conspiracy is not found to be there. And that's because in life, things actually are random. That's the most terrifying thing about it. It would almost be in some way a relief to discover that JFK had been assassinated by the Soviet Union or the mafia, because it would mean there was greater order within the world than there really is. The truth is that Lee Harvey Oswald was just insane.
By definition, meta and grand conspiracy theories run counterposed to social chaos theory, and people are more likely to believe and are more subconsciously willing to believe that these events have got a pre-planned order to them rather than just random ill-fated tragic events. Obviously we saw that in this country with Princess Diana, which blew up into its own conspiracy theory itself. Now, on that point, in terms of global conspiracy theories, we can see them occurring under different social contexts, under different national contexts, and different incidences. Now, 9/11 was global because it had global consequences in itself, not more so for the act on terror and the policies distributed by the EU and America in concordance with the war that eventually occurred in the Middle East. With that in mind, as a historian of the United States of America, would you say there's something more endemic in America's historical culture that makes them more susceptible to conspiracy theories, or do you think that point's overstated and that people on the European continent just as easily believe and propose conspiracy theories as do the Americans? From the outsider looking in, it does look like the majority of American conspiracy theories tend to be either on both extremes. That's either ultra-radical leftist Marxists or ultra-right-wing conservative religious groups. Do you think that the Americans have more of a track record in espousing conspiracy theory than other parts of the world?
I would say, first of all, as a caveat, that the examples you've just given, whilst there was not behind any of them a grand meta-conspiracy, there were lots of little conspiracies involved in them. Even the death of Princess Diana, you have the conspiracy of press harassment. You have the conspiracy of a woman who's been driven away from her family. What there wasn't a conspiracy to do is kill her. So my point being that in both Europe and America, we must be sensitive to the fact that lots of little conspiracies can very easily form a mosaic that in some people's mind becomes a pattern that produces a meta-conspiracy. I would say there is a slight difference in the culture between America and Europe because Americans are obsessed with big government. They are frightened about the concentration of power. That is what their political culture was created in order to avoid. And they have consistently reacted against external threats, internalized them, turned them into conspiracies, and conducted their political discourse in the language of a conspiracy theory. So you go right back to the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, and you have the conspiracy of the Catholics. And from that, you get the Know-Nothings, and from the Know-Nothings, you get the embryo of the Republican Party. A lot of the Republican Party is rooted in that reaction against urbanization and immigration. And then you fast forward to the 1930s and you have the Jews, and the 50s you have the communists. And they're very much mixing the language of the outsider and the insider infiltrating. And I think that's what, because America defines itself so differently from Europe, because it sees itself as being different from Europe, as being extraordinary, it naturally sees itself as being under attack by foreign ideas and by foreigners assisted from within. So I would say that has always been a central and important aspect of America's political culture. I would add finally that that may have been ameliorated had they developed a proper language of class, and they didn't. In that sense, America is still very 18th century. It's still very in love with its ideological view of itself as a meritocracy or a land of equal citizens, any of whom can do whatever they like, etc., without the classic class conflict, which is the great conspiracy, the great European conspiracy of the 20th century. Without that, they're more focused on foreigners and foreign ideas. And of course, class itself is a conspiracy, and the language of class is a conspiracy. And that's why the federal government actually used arms to destroy it and to destroy the trade union movement in the 1910s and 1920s.
It's a very appropriate surmising framework. In terms of the insider protecting itself from the outsider, I'm assuming that you'd put the Obama birther conspiracy issue in that category as well.
Absolutely. I hadn't even thought of that, but that's a brilliant example. That they can not only say that Obama is a radical socialist, which again, it's rational to say on the basis of his policies because they do represent a dramatic break from the American tradition, but they cannot only say that. They also have to say he's a foreigner. And not just a foreigner, but someone with a religious difference as well. And that religious difference happens to be the grand conspiracy of the moment, which is Islam. So there is exactly that. The enemy within is turned into the enemy from without, who has broken into our camp and who is pretending to be something he is not. The most absurd example of that I discovered is that one Tea Party group has produced a DVD which claims that Obama was the illegitimate son of a black Soviet agent. And there are so many Foucauldian internal fascisms being expressed in that absurd conspiracy theory. It's bringing in blackness, it's bringing in communism, it's bringing in the Soviet Union, and it's implying that from his conception, Barack Obama was an enemy of America because he's actually sired by a black communist. So yes, I think that's a very, very good example of what I'm talking about.
Now, in terms of the use of energizing discourses and social movements away from one area of conspiracy theory and channeling them into another area, in your book about Pat Buchanan and the American Crusader, you spoke about how these fringe ideas and movements can be exploited, but this is a good thing in itself. For example, Pat Buchanan was able to energize certain right-wing anti-New World Order energies that otherwise would have been wasted on people like David Duke or militia terrorism. So if you could just explain some of those ideas behind that thinking in terms of how seizing upon potentially fringe conspiracy theory ideas and moving them into the mainstream can have its social and political benefits for everyone else in society.
I think this happens on both the right and the left, but to take the right example, one of the good things that mainstream conservatism should do is to address the concerns of the fringe, particularly if it has some populist dimension that is capable of generating votes, is to adopt those concerns, put them into a new political framework which is far more rational and reasonable and centrist, and then co-opt all of that anger and that energy and put it to good use and to bring the extreme into the mainstream. An example of that is that in the early 90s, David Duke, the radical racialist white supremacist, had joined the Republican Party, had won a seat in the Louisiana State House, and had run for both governor and senator, and in both those races won the white vote. And people at the time were talking about the emergence of a new respectable white supremacism. Pat Buchanan, who was then running for president in 92, quite openly talked about taking his issues and his people and bringing them into the mainstream. And that's what Buchanan did by running on a platform which was about protecting jobs, which was about what he called a new nationalism that was anti-interventionist, and also by really stressing Christian, cultural, conservative themes. And as a result, when both men ran for president at the same time in 1992, Pat Buchanan got about a third of the vote in every primary, and David Duke barely scraped into single figures. I mean, he got around 4 or 5% in most of the primaries, and Duke's career was pretty much over. Equally importantly, Duke went out of his way to try and get photos of him and Pat shaking hands. He turned up at all of his events, and Buchanan made sure that he never gave him that opportunity. He never let him do it. So in a way, because he was now the respectable right-wing figure, Buchanan was able to deny Duke publicity and to take away some of his legitimacy. And Pat Buchanan to this day is very proud of the fact that he pretty much single-handedly destroyed the white supremacist movement of the early 90s by taking its ideas and its people and putting them to a mainstream use. And I think in that way it can be helpful because it can diffuse the tensions that exist on the extremes. And this has happened throughout American history. This happens in the 1990s with Ross Perot. This happens way back in the 50s with anti-communism. You see these extreme movements entering into one of the mainstream parties, and all of its unpleasant radicalness is sort of filtered out, and the populist anger, which is often about legitimate issues, ends up becoming part of the mainstream party's agenda.
Now, with all this in mind, from a historical perspective, would you say it's safe to assume or at least present a partial argument that these types of conspiracy theories are usually the advocations of those that are on the fringe of society and disenfranchised? So once you present them with a slightly alternative political perspective and ideology, then you're able to change at least some of their ideological belief systems in society. So I personally argue that someone that advocates an Alex Jones type of conspiracy theory is essentially on the left of the political spectrum, that no longer sees the appeal that's viable in international Marxism. Would you therefore say that most conspiracy movements are just for people in society that are disenfranchised by current political ideologies?
Well, the first part of the question partly answers the second part, which is this point about when people join the mainstream parties, do their ideas shift or change, or do their personalities undergo a change? In my experience of writing about Pat Buchanan, in other areas this may not be true, but in my experience the answer is no. Quite often they regard themselves as entryists. they always maintain and retain some dimension of thought which puts them outside of the mainstream. They're usually very proud of that, and they see their role within the party that they've just joined as a temporary thing, and they are using it. And I think the Tea Party today still defines itself very much in those terms. So, just because people shifted from David Duke to Pat Buchanan, which they did, does not mean that they lost their racist conspiracy thinking. Who then does a conspiracy theory speak for? I don't think people who follow them are always disenfranchised. Quite often they're quite intelligent people. They're normally very well educated. Nowadays they're almost all technologically literate in a way that, to a degree that even I'm not. They've mastered the internet very, very well. I don't know if it's... I think the answer is partly that I can't really answer that because I'm not a psychologist. I'm not sure if we need to look at a certain personality type. I'm not sure if it's the product of a set of specific economic and social circumstances. All I know is that the phenomenon is probably a lot more common than we give it credit for. And I don't think it's purely about people who are literally disenfranchised. It's probably more about people who define themselves as being disenfranchised. But the problem with that analysis is that growing numbers of Americans call themselves disenfranchised and don't identify with either party. So I don't think it's purely a product of the fringe.
One result done at University of Kent illustrates that people that are more willing to conspire themselves are therefore more willing to believe in conspiracy theories in general. If you believe that you've got the potential to scheme and conspire under certain circumstances, then there's a plausibility to...
And that kind of supports the point that I was making about how people, just because they join the mainstream party, doesn't mean they drop the conspiracy thinking. On the contrary, they often approach joining the mainstream party with a similar mindset to the conspiracy that they see around them. And that's something I've noticed from a lot of the Pat Buchanan people I've interviewed. They don't see themselves as Republicans. They see themselves as entryists who are trying to outsmart the conspiracy that they think is around them.
What occurs with this, though, at this stage is certain paradoxes begin to emerge. Now, I generally believe that most people that seriously advocate certain aspects of what I would class meta-conspiracy theories, that's not everyday conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories by definition exist in all different contexts every day. Grand meta-political conspiracy theories are where there is obviously deliberate pre-framed structure of how to organise and execute an event. Now, what can happen there if you believe in a serious conspiratorial movement, say you get behind someone like David Icke or Alex Jones, by almost political and social definition, you're no longer finding appeal in the Democratic or Republican Party or any mainstream ideology. So you'll therefore begin to look for another framework that makes sense of social and political phenomena. Now, you're saying to a certain extent that it's not necessarily people that are disenfranchised, but people that perceive themselves to be disenfranchised. And this concordance happens in everyday situations. Obviously, people probably perceive themselves to be something that they're not. But with that aside, the paradoxes then emerge in terms of someone like Ron Paul that comes to the fore, which he advocates certain ideas, not deliberately, but ideas that resonate with certain conspiratorial movement. Yet paradoxically, he's gotten himself in the mainstream. So on the one hand, you're left with this cognitive dissonance if you're a conspiracy theorist, which is this is how the American business world and political world operates, and it's to a large extent pre-planned organised corruption. Yet on the other hand, someone like Ron Paul, who defends my views to a certain extent, is allowed into this mainstream political area. That's one area where the paradoxes occurs. So I just wanted to get your perspective on what the appeal behind Ron Paul is, because he walks a tightrope between a stereotypical everyday politician, yet he has a lot of support from fringe social movements, more so I would say than Pat Buchanan. So if you just explain your thoughts on that, please, Tim.
Something which is similar, which is germane to Pat Buchanan, to Ron Paul, or to Ross Perot, is the concept of purity. The idea that the man is a non-politician. They don't need this. They don't necessarily want this. This is something that history has forced them to do. And if you read the biographies that are written of them, which are almost all hagiographic, you'll find that that consistent theme is a little man who came from nowhere, who cannot be bored, who is utterly motivated by ideas, who has never U-turned once, never lied. That's the guy who they are prepared to follow. and therefore that they can resolve that, well, not resolve the paradox, but they can suffer it. Because yes, they are now engaging in the grand conspiracy of mainstream politics, but their guy that they're following himself is not part of that conspiracy because he is pure. And that's the thing I consistently have noticed about Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan and everything I've read about them, is always comes back to this idea that they are different, that they are above ordinary politics, and that's what makes it okay to follow them. And to be fair, it's generally true. I don't think you pull that off unless it is true. And of Pat Buchanan, considering that most politicians, one of the very first charges raised against them is that they have U-turned or they've changed their mind or they've lied, I could never find one example ever of Pat Buchanan being accused of having U-turned or misled an audience. He literally has never done it. He just says what he thinks. And because he thinks according to a very strict ideological framework, what he says is never contradictory and never changes. And that's what makes it okay to follow those guys.
So the issue here is more about the philosophical theme of purity and to a certain extent honesty and innocence. So with that in mind, obviously that's a great framework to place Ron Paul in the terms that on the one hand he is viable and can enter the mainstream political circus, yet on the other hand he's divorced from it because he is the pure thinking man who rises above politics and isn't involved. But doesn't that produce an almost a messianic and apocalyptic result, because inevitably the purist is still going to be destroyed by the system?
Mm-hmm. And you are primed to expect their defeat. And that person almost cannot win. And therefore no one is surprised when he does. And then you get people around them who are traitors. You also get a lot of Judases. So, for example, among some people, Pat Buchanan's sister, Bae Buchanan, is the Judas. Not everyone has this opinion, but some people feel that she has manipulated him or used him in order to advance herself. Around Ron Paul, I've noticed that Rand Paul is starting to emerge in some people's eyes as the Judas because he endorsed Romney. He's someone who's been in mainstream politics too closely and who is starting to become corrupted by it in their view. So yes, I agree with you. They are primed for defeat. Their followers expect that defeat. And one wonders, and it's not been tested because they never win, one wonders how they would actually react if they did win, and if that would in some way end up corrupting their vision and their image.
That's actually a very interesting point in terms of the social psychology behind conspiracy theories, because then obviously you're faced with another cognitive dissonance that you have to amend yourself. So on the one hand, you put forward the purist type, such as Ron Paul, and you say this guy represents all that is true and pure. I'm not expecting him to win, but at least he's getting out there. Then when he doesn't win, he's like, well, of course he's not, because he's the purist in the lion's den, so to speak. Yet on the other hand, if he does win, then you're presented with this ideological schema where you now have to justify how the meta corruption and conspiracy operates on one hand, yet on the other hand allows people to succeed. And you see this, how it's a very interesting idea how conspiracy theories themselves evolve in the light of evidence that contradicts it. It's a circular paradigm. So for example, the old archetype of the President of the United States being an all white boys academy, largely out of Yale and Harvard, that was perpetuated for many years, and then we have a president who's mixed race and not completely white for the first time in history. So that presents you with a disconcordance in your ideas, and now we have the Black Freemason conspiracy theories, which is there is a separate sect and branch of conspiracy theories that tailor for successful black people, which on the one hand reconciles your old conspiracy theory in a light of new evidence, yet on the other hand is extremely insulting and offensive, because obviously it by definition dictates that these people can only get to these positions by being in their own network of conspiratorial actors.
Yes, and that theory is floated not just by the right but also by the left. So you have people like Cornel West essentially saying Barack Obama's not really black. That he's the product of, as Cornel West put it, he is the product of a political circle of white Jews.
Yes. He's got white Jews that are puppet masters behind him, and this is the latest toy they brought to the party. Just one thing before I let you go, Tim, from a historical perspective. You've discussed how historically America has this legacy of the insider protecting itself from the outsider. They've got issues of purity, again protecting themselves from outside cynical ideologies. And lately, obviously, we've seen this kind of massive explosion with 9/11. We've also seen the Obama birther conspiracy, and other palatable ideas have come to the fore, such as we now have the climate change conspiracy, which certain elements to it, from my perspective, only present themselves in the American social and historical context for largely the reasons you just said. I wouldn't believe too many people on the European continent vis-a-vis the American continent would believe that climate change is some kind of elaborated idea by scientists in a lab, as where in America, by its culture, some people are more ready to believe and affirm that idea. With all this in mind, with the historical context, what do you think, and obviously a historian never makes certain predictions for the future, but what do you think the future will hold in terms of conspiracy theories in American political culture?
Well, we'll wait and see who wins in 2012. There'll be a conspiracy theory developed around that, whichever way it goes. You're right, you can't predict it, but I do think that because American culture is so into tropes and types, that you can pretty much guess the sort of ideas that will be put forward. I mean, you mentioned climate change, and this is rooted partly in the conflict within America between federal land ownership and private land ownership. It's partly about this issue of a small group of people trying to stop us from enjoying what is our birthright as Americans, which is to use the land in any way we see fit. And that can mean building a coal-fired station. That can mean burning tires. It doesn't matter. You know, Ann Coulter once famously said that the American dream was, I'm paraphrasing, but the American dream was to have jet skis, a barbecue, you know, be able to smoke cigars and do whatever you like with the land. And when asked, but what do you do then when the land is exhausted? She said, well, we'll go to Mars. And she meant it quite seriously. And that is the American dream. So given that, we can pretty much guess that whatever hot political topic comes up in the future, some element of conspiracy thinking will be applied to it, and it will probably follow what we've discussed before, this idea of outsiders and insiders, and elites versus ordinary people, and it certainly will be there. It will not go away. This is not situational. This is sort of inherent to American politics.
I would agree with that to a certain extent. I think the future for conspiracy theories in general is culturally and socially they're endemic as long as humankind's been around as cognitive thinking creatures. By almost social definition, obviously you have to second guess and assume the ideas, motivations behind other agents and actors. So conspiracy theory is hardwired into people's schemas. So for the future, I think a lot more research has to come out in the area of social psychology, understanding under what context people believe conspiracy theories and why. And then on the other hand, we need more analytical work in terms of philosophy and social scientists, and that's also to do with obviously social phenomena and the semantics applied to social phenomena. So under what circumstances you mean by this type of conspiracy theory and whether it's viable and exists, because actually we have the conjoining a lot of the time between conspiracy theories all grouped and meshed into one where that isn't the case. So there are single point conspiracy theories such as Watergate. You see WikiLeaks obviously alluring to certain types of conspiracy theories. They can occur on the one hand. On the other hand, the more irrational and wild conspiracy theories, such as David Icke's alien reptoid theory, they also come into the phrase. So it's about really separating the two and explaining which ones are more likely to be plausible and rational, and separating the bad from the good, as with any other discourse. And unfortunately, at the moment, actual conspiracies that do exist don't get the attention because they're tarred with the same brush that, oh, you're just being irrational and insane.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that. And I would also close with a plea that it is worth investigating and studying conspiracy theories, partly because they're very interesting, but also because they can teach us lots of other things that we didn't expect to know or to discover.